Hey, it's Soul with another video brought to you by the cool people to the right. Not my left, your right, whatever. Anyway, today's video is going to be about game design, which means we're going to forego the typical B-roll footage that's, shows up in front, and we're just going to talk about feedback on WoW's current game design and then offer ideas on how to improve on it. If you didn't know already, I enjoy talking about WoW's game design, so check out a link below. It's called the World of Warcraft. It's a whole playlist full of things where I make suggestions and talk about other weird ideas. And of course, subscribe to the channel for more design fanfiction. As I usually say in these kinds of videos, it's very easy to unite a large group of people under the banner of wanting change. Hell you are! Whew, sorry. However, when we really start talking about the specifics on exactly how to go about this change, then that unity falls apart because so many of us have all sorts of different ideas. Today I offer you one such idea for you to examine, dissect, and roast for your entertainment. So today's subject is on item level bloat. It's about the difference in power that our characters obtain over time in a season or an expansion, and it's too damn high. Item levels have been shooting through the roof, and too quickly does relevant content outclass the most previous content to the point where it just feels like only the present matters. Now, there are those among you who are watching thinking, well, what's the problem? I live in my own little world, and I don't care what the mythic people do or the gladiator people do. I just want to play WoW the way that I feel like it. And with that in mind, this presentation hopes to preserve that gameplay style, whatever that is. What we're trying to address here is how item level affects the relationships between players as well as how we interact with the world. It's thanks to this item level bloat that we've seen 2 big old stat squishes in the span of only 3 expansions. Remember, we hit item level 1000 in Legion, and that was just 1 expansion after the first stat squish. The Battle for Azeroth expansion gave us our second squish and brought us all the way down to an item level of around the mid 200s or so. So Blizzard had crammed vanilla and every expansion down to 200 or so item levels. Since then though, we've only gone through 2 major patches so far, and already we're at an item level of about 450. 450, that's double the amount that we started with. The bloat that we have right now is the reason why the difference between a freshly leveled character and a huge big bad mythic raider are worlds apart in terms of power. By consequence, that's why we've seen things like catch-up mechanisms and soft item level scaling all throughout the world, where we see content losing relevance over a single patch, and that necessitates more scaling, titan forging, and more. All for the purpose of trying to narrow the gap and make progression feel a little bit more natural. The recent trend, the flavor of the month among critics right now, is to call for a level squish that could help solve a lot of the problems, including the bloat that we see today. We've seen many indicators, as well as even internal Blizzard stuff, that indicates, well, this might actually come very soon. But we have to ask ourselves, what's the relevance here? What does a level squish really solve? I totally get that it would help the leveling process feel more natural, at least up to the most current expansion, and it set the stage for more meaningful class design from the top down, as well as moving forward. I recently talked about and theorized the scenario where this can happen, where we can shrink the 120 levels down to maybe half of that and scale WoW's 15 years worth of expansions down to something more palatable that would benefit players. But that would only benefit the leveling process and not what's current. Shrinking the 120 levels down to maybe half of that, and then scaling WoW's 15 years worth of expansions down to something more palatable, it would benefit players. So a level squish is only one piece of the puzzle when it comes to solving class design in the World of Warcraft. What makes item level bloat even a thing is something that's in front of our faces, but it's not an easy concept to design around. And what I'm talking about are the multiple raid difficulty levels between Raid Finder, Normal, Heroic, and Mythic raids. 4 difficulties of raiding is nothing new. I mean, once upon a time we had itemization options between 10-man, 25-man, 10-man heroic, and 25-man heroic. But modern itemization really began with Warlords of Draenor and the first stat squish. 4 official raid difficulties, and 4 possible versions of the same item. And now, thanks to Warforging and Titan Forging, it's been mucked up all the more. We can squish stats and levels all day, but when the current expansion still has 4 difficulty levels across 3 tiers or seasons or whatever you want to call it, it's not going to take very long until we're back on the same boat. Let's be clear, itemization in the World of Warcraft is dictated by its raids. The raid reward system is linked to the other reward systems, from outdoor questing to dungeons to professions and PvP. Since the beginning, WoW has long moved away from the old raid or die formula, at least in the sense of the highest level gear coming from a single source as it used to. So it's the growth of item level, if not item level itself, that has to be equivalent. Going back briefly to the question of why does fixing this matter, consider how trivial outdoor content becomes after you reach a certain level. Consider how quickly your gear doesn't matter as soon as a new tier of content is released, and how raid participation from previous tiers just falls off overnight. So how do we prevent such massive item level differences? One of the solutions that critics proposed is a very simple one, is to remove one or more of these difficulties. Typically, it's been to remove the raid finder and the normal difficulties because, who cares about those plebs, right? /sarcasm. But like it or not, the World of Warcraft is a game of accessibility. We can choose to play only the raid finder difficulty, or choose to run Mythic Plus dungeons, be a top gladiator, a role player, a profession person, a pet battler, or a classic enthusiast. Or of course any combination of these. What is given cannot be so easily taken away, at least not with a whole lot of bitchin'. So for the purpose of this presentation and common sense design, removing raid difficulties is not an option. Okay, you might be thinking, but Soul, if you're not going to take away these difficulties, how do you address item bloat? Blizzard has said numerous times in posts and Q&As that the strength of items between one item level bracket or one difficulty and the next, it has to feel noticeable. If it doesn't feel noticeable, then players and teams who move on from one difficulty to the next, it's not going to feel as rewarding to get that snazzy upgrade that's supposed to matter, but it doesn't. Consider the Crucible of Storms raid that came with Season 2 of Battle for Azeroth. That raid didn't come with an item level bump. And speaking anecdotally, that raid just didn't feel as rewarding as a traditional raid would, despite some of the more interesting items that came out of it. Today we basically have 4 versions of every item in a given raid, give or take like War Forging and Titan Forging as mentioned earlier. So here we go folks, the moment you've been waiting for. My idea, this bad idea that I have, is that if we can't reduce the number of raid difficulties, we'll just reduce the number of levels of items instead. What we're going to do is cut the item level spread from 4 versions to 2 versions, which will effectively cut item level growth by half. So instead of raid finder, normal, heroic, mythic gear, we're going to have 2 kinds of gear. And I'm just going to call it lower tier and upper tier. The lower tier raid gear will drop from both raid finder and normal versions. The upper tier gear is going to drop from heroic and mythic versions. This sounds pretty crazy, maybe stupid or both, but hold off on the comments for just a few more minutes. Let me explain how all this is going to work. Let's dive in. I'm going to throw up some numbers on the screen. This right here is the current numerical spread of item level from the first season of Battle for Azeroth. Back then, heroic dungeons gave out item level 325 gear. Mythic dungeons, as well as raid finder difficulty, gave out an item level of 340, normal gave 355, heroic gave 370, and mythic raids gave out 385s. So across all 4 of these raid difficulties, all the same items, just 4 different versions of them. In this new version, raid finder and normal difficulty will drop item level 340 gear. Heroic and mythic will drop item level 355 gear. But now let's look closer at the differences at what players are going to get depending on the version that they play. We'll cover heroic and mythic difficulties first, which are meant to drop 355 gear. For mythic difficulty, it's gonna just drop gear the same way it does now, so nothing is gonna change. At heroic difficulty though, roughly half the item types on boss loot tables will be the upper tier of gear. The other half will be made up of the lower tier of gear. Huh? Is probably what you're thinking. So let's look even closer at what you're going to get in heroic raids. Like I said, the heroic loot table is going to be split in half, where one half is of the lower tier and the other half is of the higher tier. So let's make up an example. So on the heroic loot tables, these item slots are going to drop at item level 340. The helmet, chest, feet, wrist, neck, trinkets, and weapons. The other slots are going to drop at an item level of 355. Shoulders, belt, cape, rings, pants, gloves, and weapons. Essentially, Mythic difficulty will still drop all the best gear. Heroic difficulty will drop half of the best gear. But take a look at some of the differences here. I'll point out that when it comes to certain items like trinkets, you are only going to get the best versions of these drops from Mythic difficulty, while the rings, which give a high degree of secondary stat customization, drop from both the Heroic and Mythic difficulty. As another example, I also decided that the upper tier of weapons should drop from both Heroic and Mythic. So it's not going to be like in Heroic raids you only literally get half the loot table, it's just that one half of the loot table comes at a lower item level. So now let's take a look at Raid Finder and normal difficulty. Normal difficulty will drop the full assortment of item level 340 gear, just like how Mythic drops 355s. Raid Finder is going to have a mix, an assortment of 340 gear, but half of that is going to be a step down to item level 325 gear. So in a way, there's going to be sort of three versions of raid gear. 325s, 340s, and 355s. But consider the fact that 325s and 340s also drop from Heroic and Mythic dungeons respectively. So in this case, item levels overlap. There isn't exactly an extra bump in bloat. The idea here is that raid difficulty is going to be separated not just by the item level of the gear that drops, but the availability of what it is that drops. Of course, there are some immediate flaws we can identify with the system. For one, regular Mythic dungeons would now be equivalent to normal difficulty rating, which at the moment is one step up. We just talked about fighting against the notion of moving up to more difficult content that doesn't feel rewarding, so what gives? Aren't I contradicting myself? Also, knowing that you're working towards only completing half a set of gear if the most that you raid is either the Raid Finder or the Heroic difficulty levels, well, that only feels like half of the reward for the complete job, right? This leads to an idea that Blizzard loves to provide solutions for, which is to give reasons for players to repeat content like raids, dungeons, and whatever over and over again. So on top of these updated loot tables, we're going to use a simple catch-all, a vendor. Killing bosses will drop a specific currency, which is similar to the Breath of Bwonsamdi or the Sanguicell items in BFA that are somewhere in your currency tab. This currency can be used to fill out gaps when the content is current, and afterwards you can use it to buy transmog, I guess. Of course, this currency can't be used to buy pets, mounts, or non-gear items from the raid. At Blizzard's discretion, any number of items can also be excluded from purchasing via vendor, like trinkets. That could be an example. And as for how quickly this currency can let you gear up, I'm not going to go there in detail here because it would probably distract from the conversation, but the goal would be to find a reasonable middle ground that makes it worth farming without trivializing the efforts of actually trying to get the gear to drop. So what are some consequences to cutting item level gains in half? For one, it makes tertiary bonuses like Warforging and extra sockets extremely powerful, to the point where we've really got to sit down and discuss whether random bonuses like these should still exist. When it comes to Titan Forging though, well, narrowing the item level gap by half pretty much negates the need for such a system. In this situation, I would strongly suggest getting rid of Titan Forging. I'm speaking personally here, but I think it's healthier for players to see a path towards growth rather than seeing this foggy chance for growth. I know that my motivations are very different when I know that I can work towards something, as opposed to using tokens of false hope, and at the end of the day, I'm no closer getting to that piece of gear that I want. So what else? What happens to the other 2.5 pillars of WoW's endgame content? World quest rewards, as well as emissaries, simply follow a trend based on the current season, so it's not really a big deal there. The PvP reward system wouldn't change very much either. I mean, similar to World quest rewards, there would be fewer item level brackets to move through as your rating gets higher. But Mythic Plus might be in a weird place due to how rewards are distributed. Gear would have to scale up a little bit slower since there are fewer item level brackets to work with, but then there's the weekly chest. I can't speak to what works out best, especially when we consider that Azeroth gear isn't likely to follow us to future expansions, but I will point out the following. Currently, completing a raid grants chances for multiple pieces of gear, as well as a chance to end the week with absolutely nothing. Completing a Mythic 10 guarantees a piece of top-end gear. As a player works the weekly chest, the likelihood of this item being something you don't want, it gets higher. But generally, gearing up in Mythic Plus, mathematically, is pretty front-loaded. Something here is going to have to change, but that's really going to be a discussion for a different day. A system like this isn't really going to be a complete solve, but it is a significant reduction in item level growth over the course of an expansion, which naturally means more steady growth in the long run. Depending on itemization and expansion features in the future, this narrow spread of item level rewards means a return to earlier days when gear upgrades still meant something, but future content didn't immediately trivialize the previous content. There's a greater likelihood that people will want to run the previous tier's raids because there's still reasonably powerful gear to be had. Going back 2 or more raids, that's a bit much, but not going back at all, that's also a bit much. So what do you think of this? I know that this is a very sensitive subject to touch on because messing with anyone's chances at loot and gear is like poking the bear, so I'm sure I'm going to get mauled by the comments. As always, share your thoughts in a comment below. Like the video if you enjoyed yourself, feel free to check out the World of Warcraft playlist for more game design talk, and subscribe for more of this and all things Warcraft. I'll see you next time. Until then, stay safe, stay happy, and stay breezy.